Hello, hello, hello. If you're here already, fantastic. Welcome and good afternoon. But bear with us. We'll wait for 90 seconds-ish before we kind of get started properly. I don't know whether you've seen any of the rest of my podcasts or LinkedIn Lives, Jamie, especially if you listen to them as a recording, is that you get this 90 minutes of mumble, which makes sense live, but probably not so much when you're recording it and listening to it as a playback. But
well, if you're asking me questions, then teeing it up with some mumble just sets the tone for what I'll give you later. So all good.
No, mate, it'll be better than that. Don't worry. I've even talked about the weather before. I mean, that's proper mumble. But yeah, no. But if I had the time to edit everything and set up like a proper podcast, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, you need to.
Maybe in the future, I have to pay
get a content team behind you and videographer and all the rest of it. Yeah,
all that. But we're not there just yet. I'm not Stephen Bartlett level just yet.
He might have had the advantage of a bit of capital rolling into his. So.
Yeah, the however many millions he had for selling a social chain. Yeah. But dude, no, thank you. I'm looking forward to this conversation. If you are here already and have questions for Jamie and want him to answer anything about what we're covering, or have some kind of questions that you want answering, chuck them into the comments, and I will ask Jamie, or Jamie can see those and Jamie can answer those himself as well throughout the session. But I'm really interested to hear. I know a lot of companies are going through this challenge, and engaging and supporting people on the front lines may be harder to reach, and how do we get to them and support them in the best way we can. And from what we've spoken about, I think what you do is really great, and there could be some really key learnings for people to take away.
Fingers crossed. Give it a go.
There we go, shall we? So let's just quickly do introductions. I'll introduce myself first, and we can get that out of the way. Obviously, if people don't know me, my name's Rich. I am the founder of Employees Health. I'm a high performance coach and help leaders on a one-to-one and group basis improve their performance, reach their potential, and help them become better leaders. My background is in physical health and sport, and I use a lot of that knowledge that I've learned to help support and share, so people can kind of maximize their potential. Got a huge potential already. And Employees Health is a workplace wellbeing company which kind of will support a wellbeing strategy in various different ways, through mental health first aid to health checks to workshops, massage at work, all these different kind of fun bits to make a strategy complete, I guess. So that's me out of the way. I'll let Jamie introduce himself so I don't butcher it. But Jamie, welcome.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure to be here. And I think when we first connected, we realised that we could pretty much copy and paste in terms of our intros and backgrounds. There's a lot of shared ground there, isn't there? Which, hopefully tees us up for an interesting conversation today. So, yeah, I'm Jamie. I'm the group head of health and wellbeing at Serco. I've been in this role for about 3.5 years. I can touch on who Serco are as well at a later stage. Prior to that, did a similar role in a few trusts in the NHS, where I'm based up in Derbyshire, and background is psychology, which studied up at Leeds, and then some professional sport in there as well. So for me, there's this real kind of interest in the front line, which is obviously the kind of the title of what we'll get into today, and where can we make wellbeing improvements where it's not kind of neat and tidy, where it's a bit messy, it's a bit gritty, and things don't fit neatly into boxes. And then also this intersect between kind of wellbeing and performance, right? And I think that's kind of where we've got a real shared interest, that we can send people off on meditation retreats and things like that, and that's all great, but it doesn't get a job done. And a lot of the environments where we're really looking at this, there's a job to be done, and it needs to be done well and safely and all the rest of it. So how can we make sure we can do that sustainably with people's wellbeing baked into the mix? So yeah, that's me, and look forward to getting into it.
Yeah, dude, I think you just smashed that intro, and I think you've explained it Wellbeing at work really nicely there. Actually, everybody's got a job to do, and making sure that people are supported, but with that foresight of we're still here to work well, which is a really key part of it all. It'd be interesting to learn a little bit more about kind of your role and what you've been doing in regards to kind of being a head of Wellbeing at such a large organization with so many cross levels of employee.
Yeah. So I think I'm still figuring it out 3.5 years into it. That's the beauty of bigger businesses, right? So when I joined kind of 3.5 years ago, we were just coming out of the tail end of pandemic. My predecessor had taken the role right when pandemic struck. So kind of all of his plans very quickly turned into kind of COVID management. And he'd done an amazing job with that, and so could manage to navigate that period of challenge pretty well. My task when I first arrived was, okay, how do we mature our approach so that it's not just seen as kind of linked to COVID, but we start to have this separate idea about what wellbeing means for Serco. And then that took us to the start of this year, and then we've made some more changes this year. We've brought wellbeing and safety much closer together, and we're looking at what that kind of next iteration is. And for a kind of a quick run through, like Serco's 70 to 80,000 people, obviously with contracts rolling on and rolling off, it varies a little bit month to month, spread across 4 regions around the world. So we've got UK and Europe, we've got North America, we've got Middle East, and then we've got ASPAC, Australia, New Zealand, a little bit of Hong Kong in there. Each of those regions is split into different business units, which operate in completely different sectors. So as an example, like here in the UK, my bins are collected by Serco. We also run prisons. We also have defence contracts. Et cetera. There's an awful lot of variety in what we do, and that means that there's huge opportunity, because if I've got a challenge around something, we've got amazing forensic psych teams in our prisons who might be able to help me solve a problem that I've got elsewhere in the business. Mm-hmm. The flip side of that is name a wellbeing challenge, and we have it somewhere within our business, and there's a huge degree of diversity, which means that there aren't any kind of one-stop shop cookie cutter solutions for things. So we have to be quite flexible and creative in how we go about it. And all of the kind of the challenges that people listening to this will be familiar with around absence, attrition, all of those kind of pieces are right in the mix for problems that we're trying to solve, and make sure that our wellbeing approach dovetails into all of those people, safety, kind of other strategies too, and it's seen as an enabler and not just something that's a bolt on.
Yeah, 100%. And I know that you've kind of gone through the ISO 45003 accreditation. How much was that helpful?
Yeah, so that was something that was a nice little starting gift to me when I arrived at Serco, something that we'd been looking at as a business. Obviously, having that Australian region, people may or may not be familiar with the kind of the legislation that's arriving or has arrived in Australia, which is really seeking to mandate this psychological health and safety approach in the same way that we've got an approach for kind of working with hazardous materials or working at heights. Like, we're familiar with the precautions that we need to take for those areas. We're now seeking to do the same for psychosocial risks. So we knew that was coming down the line when first started. So we looked around for what were the best frameworks we could use, what were the things that could help guide our work in this space, and that ISO certification was obviously front and center. I literally just had a conversation with someone at another organisation this morning around how they might want to look at this. So I'm always happy for anyone listening who wants to learn more to pick up a further conversation there. And the main message that I give them is, if a muppet like me can figure out how to get a business like Serco through it, then literally anyone can. I had no experience of ISO standards before arriving at Serco. Obviously worked with health and safety closely in previous roles, but not to that level of detail. So really it's a framework which enables us to make sure that we're meeting best practice across a number of different areas. So the way that we approached that was by doing it from a group level. So looking at our management system, going through that audit process and making sure that we could, well, we initially started with a gap analysis that looked at where we needed to make improvements. We were able to do that fairly quickly because we've got a strong safety culture, as you'd expect. So that enabled us to be in a good position. Managed to get through that group audit process, which meant that we knew that our management systems, all our policies and processes were kind of as they should be or on track to be. And then more recently, we've been looking at rolling that out in some specific contracts. So we announced last month that we've got HMP Ashfield through the audit process, so first prison in the world, unless anyone tells me different, to achieve that certification. And it's something now which is giving us that tool to be able to engage our frontline operational managers with, who may be familiar with meeting other ISO standards, and it gives them that kind of ladder for seeing how they can work through some of the wellbeing's complex, right? Mm-hmm. As an operational manager, when you've got a million other things on your plate, how do you figure out how best to support people without it just being, like I mentioned earlier, a bolt on? This is making sure it's baked right into our operational processes. And I think that's the element that's often missed. We always talk HR, safety, reward when we talk wellbeing. We rarely talk operations, and this is the kind of the vehicle that enables us to engage those colleagues, give them I'm not going to say a simple framework, but it gives them a framework for being able to think about this. It aligns with things that are similar in terms of 45001 that they've done before. So it's something that we're well committed to continuing to roll this out across the business. And we think that from speaking to others, seeing how that legislation has landed in Australia, we see that as the direction of travel. So whether that arrives in kind of Europe from an EU point of view, Canada next, there's a few places looking at it, but it's both the right thing to do from a kind of common sense perspective, and it's also a business savvy thing to do. So plenty of reasons for organisations to take a look at it.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, I think you kind of hit that on the head. It's nice to have a framework to lead by, especially in large organizations, especially when you've got so many different sections that you're trying to support. They've got something which we can do this, and this, and this is how we can achieve that, rather than just what do we do?
Yeah. And it's we often talk about kind of golden threading things, don't we? And the similar pithy phrase back in NHS days was kind of board to ward. So how do we make sure that whatever the thing that we're putting in is actually properly joined up? This is what sort of really helps us do, and it really kind of holds us accountable to that. So if we are seeing a risk in one of our contracts, perhaps kind of use as a prison as an easy example, where there might be kind of an increased risk of violence due to challenge on the pressure on the prison system, which is obviously something that people have seen in the newspapers. There's how do we respond to that risk locally? How do we make sure we're assessing ahead of time? We've got effective control measures in place. We know how to measure those control measures. But then also, how does that join up into our kind of wider risk? How are we assessing that at a business unit level, which then looks across the estate more widely? Where else might that risk turn up for us? And how can we make sure that that's connected through our thinking, our governance, our policy, our process, etc., across the whole business? So it's, on the face of it, sounds quite dry when you first open the document and start reading through it. I'm not going to pretend that it's the kind of shiniest, sexiest thing in the world, but as a way of just getting us to kind of break down those silos and connect with parts of the business that all need to be working on this together, it's a really effective tool for that.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think with the ISO, because I'm good friends with Hayley Farrell, who was one of the first companies one of the first people to implement this.
She just beat us. Yeah.
Did she? Yeah. Yeah. I won't tell her then. Don't listen to this one, Hayley. But I think it talks a lot about risk rather than well-being, and actually understanding what the risks are of not doing something and how you manage risk more so than it talks about the positive well-being of the organization. And I think it's a really nice way to understand the importance of it, because it shows the potential risks of not making sure your people are well psychologically.
Completely. Yeah. And the kind of example was given to me recently, and I shared it at a couple of events last week as well, where kind of, if you think about like asbestos, the way that we deal with that is it's isolated. There's very specific procedures that you've got to to go through with it to limit exposure as much as possible. If we were to use the same kind of approach that we use in a lot of wellbeing space at the minute, we'd give people like lung resilience training. Like, so we wouldn't change their exposure. We just try and change their ability to cope with that exposure. And when you think about it in the context of kind of hazardous materials, well, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But we've not made that jump to, oh yeah, actually, we know that the evidence is there now. We quote it endlessly around the impact of stressful situations at work, the kind of the impact of high work demands, kind of low resourcing, the impact of change and transition, all of these hazard categories, yet we're not making that jump to trying to get ahead of those and do things proactively. And it's the phrase that a few people in the space use, which I now just parrot constantly, is kind of like fix the work, not the worker. It's that approach that is really challenging. I'm not going to pretend that it's easy, and I'm also not going to pretend that we've absolutely nailed this at Serco and that we're kind of absolutely gold standard. There are plenty of areas where we need to develop with this, but at least we're trying to use that framework for thinking about how we solve those problems rather than the kind of the old sticking plaster solutions, which are still fairly endemic in the wellbeing space, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good, and I love that term as well, fix the work, not the worker, because that's ultimately what's causing the majority of stress, burnout, and poor well-being, right? It's nice to do some elements of positive well-being and some holistic stuff, which is great. But the biggest stress on people is the amount of work, and the work more so than it is the stuff outside of that. So before we get into the front lines, it'd be interesting just to explore your strategy in regards to well-being. I know you've obviously shared quite a lot, and I know that obviously the IS 04003, I don't know how to say it, but you know what I mean, is part of all of this. But is there anything else you want to share in regards to what your strategy looks like?
Yeah, so I mean, the most recent strategy we've actually merged together with the safety strategy. So and that kind of is a little bit specific to Serco because of the nature of the way that we're structured, how dominant our safety culture is. It makes sense to build well-being into that, and looking at things like psychological impact as a metric which we can define and record better, and use new ways of measuring our impact. To take a step out of that, and I'll just chuck a few things at you, and we'll see what's useful. But I think kind of going back right to the beginning, when we were trying to figure out what was some of the problems that we were trying to solve, and when I landed at Serco, I kind of, as I said, arrived from the NHS, and we'd just done a really interesting piece of work there looking at COVID impact and using socioeconomic data. So there was a really clear relationship between kind of the more deprived an area someone lives in, the worse their outcomes were due to COVID. And there's a huge amount of variables that obviously drive that. So that was kind of front of mind for me when I landed. And when I look across Serco and the nature of the roles that we have, and the scale of some of those, I thought it was potentially something that needed to be in the mix. So I can see Jason's commented with his I've stolen about 5 of his phrases so far. So we'll trademark those for Jason. I can add it to the many other things that I owe him. So looking at that kind of socioeconomic impact, we did a really interesting piece of analysis where we looked at postcode deprivation score, correlated it with absence, and really clear trend. Like, makes sense logically when we think about it, right? But when do we ever bake that into our approach? So there was this kind of like lens of public health that we needed to bring into the conversation. It's not just about kind of workplace well-being, it's about that whole person view. And then we needed to try and build some, as I said, when I arrived, it was around how do we mature our approach and take it beyond just a COVID response. So one of the ways in which we started to do that was thinking about, okay, well, how can we take what we know about that socioeconomic impact, and how can we use working for Serco as a vehicle for change for them? So how can we think about, we give them a potential opportunity that nudges their life in a different direction than that kind of socioeconomic calculation might lay out for them. And that was something that people started to grasp and get behind, and see that actually, well-being is ultimately really individual, isn't it? So we need people doing things at the frontline level, giving people those opportunities for whatever it's going to be to benefit them. That could be access to therapies that resolve some kind of childhood thing, or it could be access to financial education, which helps them save towards the first house, or opportunity to get a qualification, which they've never had in the family, all of these sort of things. So that really started to kind of open people's eyes to the many different ways in which we can get into a wellbeing conversation. And then there's this thing around kind of how do we make it a feeling? So there's a lot of kind of theory in the wellbeing world. We talk stats, we talk numbers, we talk ROI all the time, but it's about human beings ultimately, isn't it? And there was a amazing comment in one of our annual surveys, which really captured this for me. And there is swearing involved, so we can add a bleep when you go onto Spotify with this.
Eventually edit it.
yeah, exactly. We'll give you some more editing work to do. And it's really simple. The question is kind of like, does your manager care about your well-being? So we're really looking at that kind of manager relationship piece. And someone had commented saying, I feel like my manager gives a shit about me. I was like, that's it. If we can get that right for people, if everyone across the organization can feel like someone gives a shit about them, that's the feel. That goes an awful long way at mitigating some of the other challenges that they might be facing. So again, we started finding these little kind of pieces of the puzzle, which on their own, they're not a strategy, they're not an approach, but they started to build this kind of overall understanding and narrative. We did a load of other activity around when it comes to kind of like webinars and shared content, which was yes, the content of that was important, but it was more about the messaging and the kind of the marketing, if you like, of saying we're going to go beyond what the normal topic is. So the easy example to pick is loads of people were doing sessions about the menopause. We did one around sex and the menopause and looked at the relationship impacts of going through the menopause and what that meant from that kind of personal point of view. Like, interesting topic, kind of went a little bit viral internally, but the signal with that was like, we know this is messy, we know this is a bit embarrassing, but we're going to talk about it, we're here for it. And that did more for some of our kind of early wellbeing work than any kind of board paper that I could have written. And then when it comes to the actual kind of strategy piece of it, I think about 3 buckets. So kind of prevent, we talk about that a load in the wellbeing space, how many of us actually do it? And that's really where I see the kind of the ISO standard as the kind of the tool that we use in that psychological health and safety approach. How can we make sure we're understanding what our risks are, defining those, getting ahead of them? Easier said than done, yes, and that's definitely a journey that we're on, but it's such a crucial part of it. The middle bucket is care. So how do we make everyone feel like someone cares for them within the organization? That also happens to be one of Serco's values. So there was a lot internally which we could pull on with that. And that goes really the kind of the 2 big levers are policy and process. So how can we make sure those are kind of as personable as possible, and manager capability. So your coaching background, you'll be well familiar with the role that can play in people's well-being. How can we equip our certainly our managers and supervisors to have more coaching style conversations than just kind of day-to-day transactional ones? And then the final piece is support. Like, we can do everything possible in those other areas, but there is inherent risk within the work that we do. When you're operating a prison or similar, there are going to be difficult things that happen. And then there's also that socioeconomic element of all of the other challenges people are exposed to outside the 9 to 5. So how do we make sure there's like access to high performing services in that space? And one of the big things that we looked at there was around like equality of access. So it's all very well badging things as kind of mental health support services, but okay, is that going to mean something to everyone? And if you're, again, example I've used many times before, but if you're a cleaner at one of our hospital contracts, and you've had a tough day, you're going home to a tough home situation, you sat on the bus, are you going to phone the EAP? Probably not. Might you text it? Potentially. Like, might you speak to a colleague? Maybe. If English isn't your first language and there's something more culturally appropriate, might you go down that? So it's those kind of challenges that we start to set ourselves and look at different ways in. And those have been the kind of the 3 pillars which continue to lean on all the 3 buckets. And there's obviously a load of activity that sits within each of those, but I think they're helpful kind of guiding principles, which I try and use to structure my thinking.
Yeah. I think it's really useful for people to understand as well. And 3 kind of core pillars to build a strategy upon, and how you can break out different elements of each in regards to a support, which I think is great.
Yeah, and then the kind of the final element I'd add to that is like I can't really have any kind of ego or too tight a grip on all of that because of the nature of the beast that is a business like ours, where you've got such variety. Like the people closest to that front line are going to have a much better idea of what's going to work than I am sat in a kind of ivory tower corporate office somewhere. So how can I make sure that I'm giving them the tools, giving them the principles to work with, and then empowering them to get on with it, and role modeling those kind of coaching conversations as well of if there's a question about how best we do it, rather than saying, oh, well, just do this cookie cutter approach. How do we invest a little bit of time up front to kind of consult and coach and be open to solutions looking completely different to what I might think they should be? And that's led to some really interesting kind of conversations and kind of obscure solutions to potential problems.
Yeah, I love that, the bespoke element to it all as well, which I think is the hardest part in large organizations.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's got to be flexible. Any approach has,
100%. And I also think just dealing with people in general, how bespoke everybody is. I was having that conversation just the other day with a couple of people actually, just regards to like it's an individual thing. Everybody has their own challenges. So how then do you support that? And the role of the organisation is what you're looking after, and one of the key parts is making sure, as you said, they're safe. You're preventing them from being unwell, and they feel like they have support.
Yeah, definitely. And then the kind of the bit that us corporate types can really play a role in is where do we give a platform to those kind of conversations? So what are kind of like our oversight groups and things like that, where we're able to pull together people who kind of, so for example, we've got a justice and immigration oversight group. We've got a justice and immigration business in Australia. We've got one in the UK. There's other elements which we're looking at around the globe. Like when you're in a prison, you're very much within those 4 walls, inward focused. So if we can create an opportunity that once a quarter, once a month, you get together with people on the other side of the world who are dealing with largely similar problems and challenges, but we'll be thinking about it in a different way, that opportunity to share across big businesses and have those platforms to celebrate where things have worked, like that kind of facilitation role, I think is really undervalued sometimes.
Yeah, agreed. And this is why I like doing this so much, if I'm honest with you. It's actually that sharing of knowledge and opportunities for people to learn. I think all of this leads us really nicely onto my next question in regards to, and you've covered some of it already, but how you're actually defining and understanding how you support your frontlines.
Yeah, and again, not going to pretend that this is a nut that we've completely cracked. When you look at kind of digital access for our people, it's a big challenge, and some of that is down to kind of digital literacy and that side of things. Some of it's down to the kind of the laptop luxury of, if you are out there driving a bin lorry, you're not going to be checking your emails all the time. And then there's also a kind of a data security challenge with it. If we like solely government contracts, that comes with a huge amount of data security, and data protection is really high up the list of things that we need to be thinking about constantly. And then just kind of some of the physical side of it. So for example, on Monday, I was at one of our custodial sites. Laptop stays in the car, phone stays in the car, Fitbit comes off, all the rest of it, like you can't take anything with you. So there's some real challenges around that side of things. So that means that when we are communicating, we need to make sure that that is kind of absolutely going to hit the spot. And that's where I think we talk a lot about communications. I actually am by no means an expert in this, but try and think of it through a marketing lens instead. So that's where, again, some of those kind of like the webinar titles that we might have done were playing around and experimenting with a kind of more of a marketing approach to it rather than just a comms approach. We're not just telling people, we want people to tell someone else as well, because that's how things will spread, and where are those opportunities for kind of viral ideas. And the kind of the thinking behind that is, if we can find a hook, if we can find a way of engaging people with Wellbeing at Serco in some way, shape or form, then they're more likely to kind of work a bit harder to find the next thing. So if we've got everything on a central wellbeing hub, the amount of people that are going to go and access that is probably not huge. But if we've been able to reach them with something else, then next time they go, yeah, actually that worked for me, so I will search through a few tabs, I will click through a few things. And that's where the role of like an allies network, champions network, whatever we want to call it, I think that's again kind of it can be undervalued. It also is something which is hugely time consuming and takes a lot of effort to maintain. And I see a lot of people set them up and then they drop off and they start to dip, because you need to stand in empty rooms. You need to kind of signal that doesn't matter whether 2 of you turn up or 200 of you turn up, we're going to keep on with the calls, we're going to keep on with the chat, that side of things. So that's been a real success for us, where we're able to bring people in all manner of roles from all different parts of the business. We have a monthly call, we've got a Teams chat that's always live, and we don't use them as kind of mental health first aiders out there kind of offering interventions. We use them as granted they do some of that, and we've got some excellent cases where they have done bits, but really it's a kind of a conduit between us at the centre and those out in the business. So in all of those check-in calls that we have with them, what are you hearing, what's coming up, what are the challenges that you're picking up, has anyone else experienced that, how can we solve that between ourselves? If we've got something new that we're wanting to bring out, we're wanting to test, we'll make sure they're always the first to know. That gives them a hook for being involved, and they get some benefit from doing it. They get to try new products and things. It also means that then when we go out onto a site, there's posters on the notice board, there's local comms going out. So people might not read a corporate email from me, but they'll read the daily briefing that gets circulated on their site. So if our ally can input to that, or they get 5 minutes at the kind of local SMT meeting, it's all of those kind of bits, really difficult to quantify and really difficult for me to stand here and say we've achieved an X percentage increase in awareness as a result of it. Can't do that. You need to trust it a little bit. But that's been definitely one of the kind of the big hitters. And you don't necessarily need to do it through a specific champions network. There's loads of other different types of champions and allies that exist within big business, and whether it be kind of through the inclusion networks and groups, whether it be through kind of more sort of corporate line things like data protection champions and that side of things. There's these networks that exist that are connected into that front line. Other things which come to mind, so we have employee partnership forums within parts of the business, again, getting into those. Trade unions, really, really important stakeholders in all of this, getting them engaged. Again, if something works, they'll be the first to tell everyone about it. Also, if it doesn't, and that can be helpful feedback, but it's also important to get that kind of engagement to make sure that we're supporting them and managing those messages. There's all of these different things which exist within large businesses. Like, can we make sure that wellbeing is in that conversation and is connected to it? Takes a lot of effort, but it's really worth it.
Nice. How much do you lean on leadership and the kind of the people you are communicating with more? How much do you kind of educate and get your management and leadership to send and create some of this messaging and support?
I mean, ultimately, kind of going back to a comment earlier, like, they need to own wellbeing. So I don't see wellbeing as my agenda. I'm a facilitator for that agenda. And a really good example of this from a recent conversation with some allies and their local leadership team, of kind of some allies picking up some disquiet, some challenge, kind of risk of burnout, sharing that back with local leadership, and leadership saying, well, that's kind of, it's anecdotal, it's like, where's the data for it? And the ally, and this is such a kind of makes me proud to think of how they approached it, because it's exactly the kind of approach that we're trying to push. They said, well, it's your job to have the data. Like, if your people are struggling or at risk, then that's on you. It's not on an ally, it's not on a well-being person, it's an operational challenge, because that impacts the work that they're trying to do and the goal they're trying to achieve. So I think that's a kind of a great example of where we need to get to. We're definitely not there consistently yet, but we're on that path to making sure that well-being is, or whatever word we want to use for it, kind of psychosocial risk, whatever else, is being factored into that kind of central decision making at all levels of the business for our operational leaders. Because when we get to that point, like, and I've said before, and again, it's slightly cheesy, but kind of the goal of any head of wellbeing within a business should be to be made redundant, because you're no longer necessary, because it's just baked in. It's how you do business. It's in there. I think most of us have got some job security for the short term, at least, on that. But that's the kind of the nature of the approach we should be taking. This is an operational issue. How do we give them the support to make sure that they can manage it effectively?
Yeah, love that. So how? Okay, so I'm going to stay on this frontline section because I think it's really important. And there's a lot of people. I know there's a lot of people who also struggle to get engagement in regards to their frontline. How do you find out what they want and how you need to support them best?
Yeah, so a few different things in that. I think having the employee reps in some way, shape, or form. So whether that is through kind of like union reps, partnership reps, allies, whatever it is, you've got to have that connection that way. So it's not, and the kind of the example is, if you rock up to one of our frontline sites and you're wearing your suit or you've got your chinos and your shirt on, the level of engagement you get versus if you rock up with jeans and polo and put a high vis on, those are going to be two different things. And I think that's a really kind of helpful prompt for thinking about how else we do things, like meeting people where they're at and communicating in their own words. So not making wellbeing stuff sound like a corporate shiny thing. Like, how can we make sure those services are available in a way which makes sense to them? And there's a number of different examples of where we've done this. So things like just kind of at one of our environmental services sites, for example, like it's a bin depot, it's a recycling centre. We rocked up and we knew there were some kind of challenges that needed. So we kind of got a porta cabin with a kettle in it and got there when the shift started at 4:45 a.m. Sat in there, invited people through, had honest, open conversations, and then off the back of that, kind of put a few things in place. The citizens' advice bus came to site kind of fortnightly after that, because that helped deal with some of the things that people were raising. And it's that level of engagement that's it's not always easy to scale, but that's going to be much more powerful than sending 5 emails and doing a webinar or something like that. It's putting some boots on the ground. It's putting some effort into it to show people that you're serious about it, and then following up, because there's an awful lot of, we'll rock up at a site, we'll say hi and wave to everyone, and then we'll disappear, never to be seen again. How do we make sure there is that follow-up and that kind of, as I say, standing in empty rooms piece of, if you keep doing it long enough, then people will start showing up. And then the kind of the other bits like cultural sensitivity, language barriers, making sure that we're kind of consulting with people to say, well, this is the message that we want to put out there. This is the service we want to offer, or this is the kind of intervention we want to look at. Like, does this make sense? How would you word this if you were to kind of communicate this yourself? How would you go about it? So again, it's that kind of getting rid of the corporate ego in it and putting things in, meeting people where they're at, putting it in a way that's going to resonate more than we might initially think. Yeah,
I like a couple of things there you said in regards to being boots on the ground, actually being on site where you can. And I know a place like Serco, with however many locations you have got, can be a proper challenge.
It's not going to be possible to do all of them, but messages pass on, people talk, and you'll build momentum and you'll create those that sense of, no, this is something that they're taking seriously. They do care about what we've got to say.
Yeah. But also you begin to find out as an average what people are thinking and needing, and then you can begin to add bits, services and supports to those kind of areas or kind of industries or mini industries you've got, right?
And linked to that, sorry to interrupt, that another really important point is when we're trying to drive change, introduce new intervention, whatever the thing might be, seek a decision for something, it's really tempting to come with a PowerPoint deck loaded with data and stats and all the rest of it. And yeah, that might get you through the door, but I can guarantee that a really powerful case study that you've picked up from being out on the front line with people, it's real, it might be a bit gritty and raw, but it shows an impact. That's going to get decisions made much faster than all the stats in the world. So it goes back to that kind of think versus feel piece. Like well-being is a feel, and we need to get in and amongst that, even if it is a bit difficult at times.
Yeah, 100%. I'm beginning to round this off for you, mate. Just want to think about some of maybe the great interventions you've done, which might spark some ideas for others when it comes to obviously frontline. So if you've got anything which really stands out, might be big, might be small, the things that kind of made a big impact.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I found both back in the NHS through COVID and rolling that into early experiences with Serco is just getting a sense for what are the conversations that aren't being had but really need to be, and finding a space, creating an opportunity for those to take place. So kind of thinking about like some of our network groups. So one of the ones which we have a number of these is our parents and carers group that is only newly established here, and that came off the back of kind of what was happening through COVID, people struggling with all of the things that being a parent or a carer like was being thrown at them during that time. In the NHS, we called it the virtual school gate, for when parents weren't able to kind of have that just kind of informal conversation around, oh, I'm experiencing this, how are you dealing with that? So we created that opportunity, very similar idea at Serco now, and except obviously much broader and much greater reach. And that's owned and run by parents and carers in the business. It's not my thing, it's theirs. But well-being is right at the heart of every conversation they have. And those aren't necessarily kind of easy, neat conversations that you can tie a bow on at the end. And that's one of those kind of HR desires for us to kind of to keep things a bit neat and sanitized at times. But getting into some really difficult topics, things like baby loss, things like that kind of fertility, like we don't need necessarily a kind of a shiny digital app solution for those things. We just need to give people the opportunity to talk about them in a safe space where they're not going to be judged, and then they can be supported peer to peer. Like those interventions don't cost anything other than a bit of time and a bit of support for the people facilitating them, but go so far both in terms of individual impact and sending a cultural message. So I think those would probably be the kind of the heaviest hitters, and just thinking about that principle of kind of where's the conversations that people want to have but they've not got a space to have, that will get you into some really interesting areas.
I'm just going to push. So I'll give you an example. You've got, I know the bin men you spoke about earlier on. I'm not making assumptions. I presume the majority of them are male.
Fair assumption.
How then are you then getting them on board or supporting them? What kind of interventions do you add in there?
Yeah, so again, it's one of those examples where it's boots on the ground. The only way you're going to engage with some of these populations is by getting out, showing willing. And we've got some great examples where some of our health and safety team, even really senior leaders, have just gone and done days in the life and gone alongside them and understood what it means to do that job day in, day out. And that's where the solutions might be completely random from what we might think. So one of them was the footwear. Like they were causing discomfort. They were not the kind of the most premium thing out there. Health and safety director saw that, understood why that was an issue when you're doing 40,000 steps a day. So worked with procurement to change that, get them better footwear. That solves the challenge in terms of the kind of immediate discomfort and well-being impact there, but B also sends a really important message of, we're here to listen. We can't solve everything. We're not going to be able to wave the magic wand constantly, but if you tell us something that's impactful, we're going to work with you on it. And that then opens the door to some of those other things. So someone might be saying, yeah, my feet are hurting today. if we're able to kind of get that conversation sorted and get some engagement with that, then if that person's having a tough time at home, they're that little bit more likely to open up about that, tell us about that, and we can find some solutions to that challenge as well, rather than bottling it up until that gets kind of to a more critical point. So one really simple example, but I think that's again, it's a principle, isn't it, of get alongside people, understand what it's like to walk in their shoes, in this case literally, and find solutions from their point of view, not from yours.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you one more example, because I think this is rife within those type of industries. I'm thinking construction, I'm thinking kind of bin men, thinking warehouse potentially as well, and probably a lot more, right? Is that element of banter which is involved in that culture. How have you dealt with that before?
So I think it probably feels a little bit more comfortable for me coming from a sporting background, because the team dynamics are very much the same, and yeah, the kind of, it's not all of it's going to find its way into kind of a HR magazine, but recognizing that kind of the way that people communicate about some of these challenges isn't going to be the kind of the sanitized PC version that we use in a kind of in a corporate office somewhere, and that's where, again, that coaching approach of just being in a staff room, having a brew with people, and when people say something that kind of you might want to initially shut down or kind of steer in a different direction, of just unpicking, saying, "Oh, what do you mean by that? What's going on behind that? Tell me more about that." And just giving people prompts, showing that you're genuinely curious and willing to listen, will take you into some really interesting areas of what's important to them, and how they interpret well-being. And again, that's where you find solutions that may not be the kind of the obvious corporate ones of pushing out kind of EAPs and the like. That's where the Citizen Advice Bus came from, because it's someone from that community who was able to rock up and understand all of the nature of the challenges that they were facing much better than I could have done, and therefore signpost to kind of local solutions. One example that I can give from one of those conversations I had with someone in that staff room was, they were in a really, really difficult place, really struggling. I asked about kind of what was good for them at the time, what worked, and they said that kind of every 2 or 3 months they'd go and watch Gloucester play rugby with some of their mates. Obviously, plenty of shared background on that we were able to get into, and through, again, that kind of curious coaching style conversation, we were able to identify that there was a local rugby club to this bloke, and actually you could rock up there and maybe you could do some volunteering, maybe you could offer to help to be a groundsman, because he'd done a bit of that in the past. And that was the thing that kind of led to him finding a community, not feeling so isolated and lonely, and getting back onto a healthier path. Like, that's not a scalable solution in terms of rolling that out to everyone, but just by one person having a conversation and being curious and not trying to be the expert, you get to a place which is much more meaningful to them. And obviously, kind of those of us that have done this for longer, that feels a bit more comfortable. People, managers, supervisors, what have you, like, that's where that kind of uplift and capability around that, giving them the coaching skills, giving them the opportunity and the time in their day to connect compassionately with people, that's where you're going to find a lot more of those kind of things happening.
Yeah. And I guess what you're saying, that's where kind of your leadership training and kind of management support and education is really vital.
Yeah, completely. It's that message, going back to what I said at the start, of how do you make sure everyone feels like someone cares about them? There's lots of ways of doing that.
Yeah. And I think that resonates as well with the question I just asked as well. Like, I think I come from a construction family. I know, and I've been on a construction site with them, and I know what the language is. I know what the banter is, and obviously they're all family, so I know they all care for me. But when I've spoken to my brother, who also then had time in a roofing firm or in a tarmacking firm, the guys there who he got on best with and he was happiest were the people who could do the banter and will give him the shit and swear at him as much as they want to. But there was also this underlying element of caring.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really nice kind of positive message to remind your allies, your managers, and even just the people, just to show that there's not, like, you can do that. Some people will respond differently. Understanding different people is important, but also show that you care as well. Show that it's part of that culture, I guess. Well, I'm not sure if I can kind of, or should I say it out loud, but actually show that that's part of the culture.
But it's starting from where the culture's at, isn't it? Like, there's no point going in and trying to create a culture which is completely kind of misaligned with what the dominant one is there. So kind of to broaden it out a bit wider, like kind of our dominant culture across Serco as a whole is around safety. So that's where we've plugged wellbeing into and using that as the lever. When you go into specific parts of the business, that culture is going to look different. So in a kind of like a commercial team, for example, the culture might be around performance. So, okay, so how do we get wellbeing and performance into the conversation? If it's kind of in one of those sides where it's around kind of banter and having fun and getting the job done, but kind of getting wrapped up and getting home, then like, there's no point fighting with that. Yeah, we might want to nudge it over time and shape it in a slightly different direction, but you've got to start where it's at, and being willing to do that will engender trust in what you're trying to do more generally.
Yeah, and recognition in regards to that as well, I think, is really important. That's something my dad always led with within construction is if you're going to ask your teams to work hard, recognize them, give them the thanks they need and deserve, because they're there to work and they understand that's their value.
Completely.
Jamie, thank you. I can't let you go just yet, though. One last question. What's your top 3 tips to supporting frontline workers?
Yeah. So I think the number one is you've got to understand what that means. So go and do the work. It was advice that I was luckily given very early on in my career. So when I was kind of going down the psychology path, I went and did care work and understood what it was like to be at the absolute sharp end of that space, and that then both gives me kind of a great degree of kind of humility and respect when interacting with those that did it, but also a kind of a grounding in like what might work, what might not work, and an ability to kind of communicate there. So I think that is like the back to floor days, the kind of the day in my shoes, all of that is really, really important. I think then second from that is meet people where they're at. So let's not assume anything from a kind of central corporate point of view. Let's put things in other people's words. Let's get them to lead the way. Let's kind of empower them to shape how that some of this might look. And then I think third is being open to some potentially kind of obscure solutions for things. So they might not fit neatly into a kind of a model, or they might not necessarily be scalable, but the things that will really matter and make a difference to people, like the whole point of wellbeing is it's individual, right? So let's make sure that's a possibility in the approach that we're taking, and we're not being too kind of focused or strict in terms of what we see as a solution. Let's be open to all manner of different things.
Like the shoes. I think that's a really
like the shoes. Exactly. Yeah.
Dude, I appreciate that. Thank you. Got some. I mean, I've written some notes, especially those 3 pillars. I think was a really great piece of advice, and where kind of different bits fill into different areas. And then also the front, how you're supporting the front lines, and trying to get people on boots on the ground to make sure that the people are listening and actually being there, so people can see that support. So thank you. I appreciate your time. I hope you enjoyed it.
My pleasure. Yeah, really appreciate your questions and our shared approach on this. It's great to chat to someone with shared values, similar background, and yeah, appreciate the work that you're doing in this space as well.
Yeah, thanks, man. I appreciate that. The next session is next week with Sean, where we're going to look at how we motivate teams. So if you're interested in listening to into motivation, how we get engagement from our teams, etc., please come along. Actually follows some of this quite nicely as well, because we'll talk about kind of psychology and all the good stuff there. But for now, have a lovely week and a lovely finish your day. Jamie, stay where you are, and everybody else, take care. Bye bye.
Cheers, everyone.